Good evening, family, and welcome back to another TCR Dialogue. As always, I invite you all to drop your locations, your district, or your state in the chats so we know who's in the room and where you're joining from. I'm excited about our observance of Black August this session. Excited for this time of dialoguing, learning, and growing together. For those who are unfamiliar with Black August, it's the commemoration and honoring of freedom fighters who gave their lives to the struggle, many of whom are still incarcerated today or who made their transitions incarcerated. We call the names of those both past and present: Mumia Abu Jamal, Janet Holloway and Janine Phillips, Reverend Joy Powell and Ruchelle McGee, George Jackson and Asada Shakur, who can never come back home, and countless others who have been incarcerated over the last 6 decades for their struggle against the state. There are people still doing the good work to free them and those doing the good work to free us. And so we have a few of the best and brightest in the fields here to speak to issues relevant to Black August and offer us some resources we can take back to our separate spaces. I'm going to introduce each of them individually, and you all can give a brief hello after I share some thoughts about you. We have with us Reverend James Woodall. Reverend Woodall currently serves as Public Policy Associate of the Southern Center for Human Rights, founder and CEO of the Major Wish Group, and co-chair of Georgia's Multi-Faith Initiative to End Mass Incarceration, which is a collaboration that was founded by Reverend Dr. Wafriel Warnock in 2019. Welcome, James.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to get into this conversation.
Yes, sir. We also have my dear friend and big sister, Reverend Jerry Wright. Among her litany of accomplishments and leadership in pioneering faith-based and justice-oriented organizations, Reverend Wright is the founder, executive director, and visionary of the Butterfly Effect, an organization designed to minister to the soul of justice-impacted women, their children, and families. She further engages and trains the Black church in transforming prison ministries to do the work of soul care for those individuals and placing emphasis on returning citizens in an effort to reduce the rate of recidivism. Welcome, Jerry. You're on mute.
Thank you so much, my beautiful, brilliant sister. It is an honor and a privilege to be here today.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. Lastly, but not least, we have Reverend Willie Francois. Reverend Willie serves as senior pastor of Mount Zion Baptist Church in Pleasantville, New Jersey, and president of the Black Church Center for Justice and Equality, a national think tank and policy advocacy organization. He was appointed director of the Master of Professional Studies program at Sing Sing and Bedford Hills Correctional Facilities, and associate professor of liberation theology by New York Theological Seminary. And in August of 2022, he released his second book, Silencing White Noise: 6 Practices to Overcome Our Inaction on Race. Welcome, Reverend Willie.
Thank you so much, Pastor Jazz, for curating this conversation and for leading the way you do.
Absolutely. All right, y'all. I don't want to waste no more time. So we're going to jump right in with the first question, just laying some foundation, because the Recorder is an extension of the oldest Black denomination and born from resistance in the prophetic imagination of alternate possibilities. I want us to start with a theological grounding. What makes this conversation regarding political imprisonment, abolition, and restorative justice relevant to our faith tradition as members of the Black Diasporic Church? And I'm going to start with you, Reverend Willie, who's pastoring right now. Just tell us a little bit about what makes this conversation relevant to our faith tradition as members of the Black Diasporic Church.
Sure. One, I think it's important to name that the traditions that we call the Black Church grow out of a resistance to white supremacy, particularly a resistance to white Christian segregationist terrorism And so when we talk about the foundations of Black churches, it's always important to name that they do not start in hallowed halls. They do not start in brick and mortar, but really start in a very curated space of freedom that we call the brush harbors, where Black people were able to affirm their humanity, reassert their God-given identity outside of the gaze of whiteness, in those places where ring shouts could happen and identity could be affirmed. So the Black churches grow out of the demand for freedom, and it grows in the context of enslavement, of confinement, of complete denigration. You cannot legitimately talk about the problem of mass incarceration, the problem of hyper incarceration, however we like to think about this particular social system that we're experiencing right now, without understanding that it is a successor of plantation economics, a successor of chattel democracy, a successor of white supremacist slaveocracy, right? And so if the Black churches were formed as a resistance to the implications of slavery, then therefore every time slavery reforms, every time it reincarnates, Black churches have to be there to do that particular work. Secondly, I say it's important for Black churches to do this theologically because we are followers of a Palestinian carpenter who himself had a particular relationship to slavery, according to some scholars, but also understanding that Jesus comes from a class of people who were crucified, right? That crucifixion is not just a given moment or a political tool, but crucifixion was an entire political culture, right? And Jesus comes from a people who were subjected to that culture. And Jesus is also an adherent, a devotee to the God of the covenant, the God of the Exodus. So often we forget that the Exodus is not just some spiritual moment, but the Exodus is really a political event. What is so foundational to the religion of Jesus, Judaism, was the political event of the Exodus, and that was a policy shift that set the captive free. And so if we're going to be true to our ancestors and true to the tradition of Jesus, who himself comes from a lynch class, who himself comes from a community of people who were failed by a justice system, killed by his own government. If we're going to be serious students of Jesus, who was himself criminalized and then executed, then we have to find ourselves on the side of those who are guilty and on the side of those who are wrongfully incarcerated and wrongfully executed.
A to the man. A to the man. Any other thoughts, Reverend Woodall, Reverend Jerry?
I definitely have thoughts. One, I'll start with this, that I think this conversation is important because in so many ways, I believe God is angry. And God is angry because we have, in some respects or some fashion, have declared that we can't breathe, right? And and I tell this story all the time about how my grandmother would sing the psalm of David that says, "Let everything that has breath praise the Lord." And when we were to take to the streets in the summer of 2020, right? And this wasn't the first time we have done this, but particularly for this conversation, it's kind of where my genesis arose in this conversation in relation to the efforts of mass incarceration. But I believe that God is angry because we are literally being suffocated. Whether we talk about George Floyd, whether we talk about the people that are literally wrongfully convicted and incarcerated, or rightfully, right? Even those who have been adjudicated as guilty and are factually and legally guilty still should be given the right of life, right? Of liberty, of humanity, of dignity, and yet they are dying. Literally today here in Atlanta, we just got word that yet another person has died. We had 2 people in the Fulton County Jail where Donald Trump was booked, right? Where everybody celebrated justice. Somebody else has died. And this is 9 people this year. In the Department of Corrections here in this state, we've had 29 people die. And many more have been injured, not just at the hands of, people in those facilities, but also staff, also healthcare, also malnutrition. And so when we think about this question of what is mass incarceration in relation to the gospel, I would argue that God is angry because the Black church is failed. because when we have these conversations, it almost always reverts to my Black church, not the Black church. And Willie made a very important distinction in relation to that prophetic tradition. And I would argue, I would submit to us tonight that many of us do not follow that tradition, because in fact, when we think about how incarceration has reverberated itself into modern day slavery, a lot of our churches are on the front lines ensuring that it is emphatically endorsed. And so we cannot talk about the Black church without acknowledging the fact that many of our Black churches are responsible for what has happened and what is happening in our names. And so I'll stop there because I know we have a lot more to do. But the theological underpinning for me in this entire conversation is righteous indignation.
Mm-hmm. I think you, Willie, and Reverend Woodall both raised a good point about the fact that we do not all have the same starting point in terms of our theology and our Black church faith traditions. And I think the same is true for our starting point about what this system is. Systems of policing and incarceration are very complex, but also very simple, depending on how we understand its purpose and function. For so many people, incarceration is the result of individual behaviors justified by the need to impose consequences or impose isolation or impose death, like you were speaking to. And for so many people, it's necessary for a society to operate. So I want you all to share with us, and we're going to start with Reverend Jerry this time. Share with us your understanding of the system and its function, and then briefly help us unpack the implications that our investment in it may have on Black, poor, and marginal communities.
So, my lived experience of the system and its function undergirds my understanding of it as anything but just. In short, it is genocide, and our investment in it means we are participating in genocide. Because of our own biases as leaders and members of the Black diasporic church, many of us do not see our incarcerated sisters and brothers as such. In fact, we discard and discount our justice-impacted family members and sit idly by, doing nothing to invest in those who find themselves separated from life outside of imprisonment. We actively participate in the destruction of our own African American community by the non-involvement and lack of participation of care of those who are incarcerated. We bury the relationship, lose the respect for, and release our responsibility to care for the incarcerated. We do not engage in repairing, restoring, or assisting with reintegration, which all lead to the death of the inner being and greatly contributes to the destroying of the Black family, the African American community, the poor and marginal communities. And then we thank God for the faithful few, as represented here, who take seriously Matthew 25:35 through 36. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. Perhaps if we began to see the incarcerated as the hungry, thirsty, stranger, naked, and sick, in addition to being imprisoned, we might begin to rethink our investment. Perhaps if we look at all individuals, regardless of their guilt or innocence, while incarcerated or walking free, as God's creation, we might definitely begin to rethink our investment in incarceration. It is at times sickening as we think of how both Willie and James responded to the first question of just how many of the Black church, and not, of course, our Black churches, but those who call themselves the Black church, who are contributing to mass incarceration, who are contributing to the genocide, the killing of those who are incarcerated, the justice impacted. It is just, as a matter of fact, and I thank God for the earlier breakdown, as I was contemplating and preparing for today just broke down when I think about just how many of us in the Black church fight for other Black churches to really be the church we need to be and do the work of which we now discuss.
So one of the things when I think about, and I call it the legal system because it's not just incarceration. It's important that we name this legal system for what it is. It is an entire society that is literally developed on trauma. It is developed on harm. It is developed on statutes that have been created and codified by individuals in power. That's what the legal system is. And when we think, and I know we'll talk about abolition here in a second, but when we think about the impact of that legal system and the function it serves in our names, right? Every single case that comes before a court and is adjudicated as guilty or innocent is done so in the name of the state of whatever, or in the name of the people of the United States. Every single function of this system is done on our behalf. And so what that tells me is we have a fundamental belief in our society. We've established institutions that work on our behalf to explore and impugn violence. That's what our legal system does, because we believe fundamentally, and if we disagree, we must work against it. But we believe fundamentally, we the people believe that in order for us to adjudge one as just, that there must be violence. And we do so in the name of the people that we serve. And so what it means then is that the communities that are implicated in that violence must be traumatized over and over and over again, because my relation to the system was one of personal reflection as well. Meaning, my father was incarcerated and still is for a life in prison sentence without parole. And so my introduction to the system is I've lost my father. Never had the opportunity to have a father in that way. And so my immediate disposition is there must be something wrong with him, which then had consequence in other areas of life. And so for many generations, for many people, the entire legal system was a plantation. And so it wasn't a different iteration of slavery. It wasn't a different way of looking at chattel slavery. It literally was slavery. It literally is slavery, because the plantation, you had no agency. In prison, you have no agency. And so I think about it in that context, because it helps me unpack how I am able to navigate in these communities and understand truly the narratives and the stories of the people that I claim I want to serve. Not even those I do serve, but the ones I claim I want to.
I think it's important to underscore here is that when we talk about incarceration as a system, it's always important to name the farce of how we talk about prisons as a part of this larger project of public safety. What we find is that the more we have incarcerated, it has not necessarily increased any new levels of safety, or even levels or any senses of safety. And so it's important to name that the reason why we have become complicit in the boom of our prison and the unaccountability of our police is that there have been these narratives that tell us that police and prisons keep us safe, therefore lulling us to sleep while we have a literal death machine marching through our communities, sucking fathers, mothers, sisters, breadwinners, taxpayers, voters directly out of our homes. From 1865 to 1968, there were less than 200,000 people in our prisons. From 1968 to 1990, to 1980, you had a roughly 250,000 people in prison. Now, since the 1980s, we have seen a 940% increase in the prison population, to the point that we have 2.2 million people who are languishing in prison, because there's this systemic attempt to make sure that Black people and brown people are politically disempowered, to make sure that they're economically cast into a system where there really is no social mobility, in spite of the promise of America, of these Horatio Alger stories that we can actually transition from rags to riches. We see this boom in prisons because we don't just have a school to prison pipeline. We literally live in what one writer calls a carceral continuum. Every single American institution, including its churches, are complicit in this prison boom. Our schools, our healthcare system, our judiciary, our legislatures, our executive branches, the various parts of our economy are all doing the bidding of white capitalism by making sure that there are places where Black people disappear, so that their political power disappears, so that their capacity to build wealth disappears. How do we reforge a white republic? Since the Reconstruction era, prisons have done that work.
I appreciate all of you all's feedback. Were you going to say some more, Jerry?
I was just going to raise the question, why then is it that we invest in that? So many of us, when there are so many of us who are justice impacted. James, thank you for sharing that, your story. We just heard James grew up without his father in the home. He was incarcerated. And what did that do? I mean, I thank God for where you are and what you're doing, the work you're doing, your understanding of it, because of how it has impacted your life. And so what do we do at this point to get others, Black churches, to really divest from their investment in incarceration and the thought process? At what point do we begin? What happens? And see, I'm coming from a real serious place of frustration after seeing it as real prison ministry was actualized under my father's pastorate, and growing up in that, where we ministered to the soul of the individual and their families, including giving them writing lessons as they were in prison, asking, we need to, so how then do we begin to shift the trajectory? Because we are the faithful few. You can literally just take note of the churches who are really doing this work, the Black churches. And so, yeah, that's
but and I don't mean to belabor this point, but that's exactly what I mean. In when you think about prison ministry, Dr. Wright, I'm not familiar with your father's ministry, but I think it probably one of the few that did it the right way, and which is why that's so remarkable and admirable. But when I have the faith community that I've been exposed to, when you think about the church ministries, and you think about folks going in to do CPE and all that kind of work inside of the facilities and these institutions, the pastor normally doesn't go. He sends, or she sends, someone who, and I hate to be like this, but the person who can't preach on Sunday morning.
Right.
We send the people that are as least of value to our ministry on a day-to-day basis. Mm-hmm. And what that says to me is that, yeah, we're going to do prison ministry, but we're going to do it in a cute fashion that makes it make sense for us.
Right.
But we really are not committed to Matthew 25, because if we were, we would see these human beings as just as worthy of our congregation's support and our ministry resources as anyone, right? And so I just wanted to add that, because it's always fascinating to me, like when I was going through seminary, who would go. The students would be the ones going to preach at the prison. The pastor, or the associate pastor or assistant pastor, they never went. But granted, they also probably were busy too. But That's just something to keep in mind.
All right, family. I appreciate you for raising that question, Jerry. And so we're going to press pause right here because we got to have our commercial break. But when we come back, we're going to pick up right there. I know, Reverend Willie, you have some things to share. I also want to respond to that question that you raised because I think it's an important one. And so we'll start there when we come back. And before we go to our commercial break, I want to say hello to the people in the chat who have said hello to us. Give a warm welcome, you all, to Brother Jackson from Atlanta. We got Sister Carolyn Fleming from Western North Carolina. Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright here to support his baby girl from Chicago. Brother Alan Christopher, Sister Carla Felton from Georgia, Sister Linda Scott, and Sister Gloria Bruce from Upper Marlboro. Hello to all of you and a warm welcome. We're glad that you all joined and looking forward to seeing you back in the space after this brief moment of pause.
And so part of what I am inviting people to do as we go in this campaign, I invite them to become a part of the Cooper experience because you want to know that the person that would be a bishop has sufficient experience and understanding and knowledge of the denomination and its workings and its ways, that they can serve well, serve the people well, serve the denomination well, as a bishop in the church. And so I'm asking people to become a part of the Cooper experience because I believe it is the kind of experience you can trust. You can trust me to do well, be well, and administer well as one of the bishops of the church. And so I ask you to become a part of the Cooper experience because it is an experience you can trust.
Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. All right, family. So we're going to jump right in with the last question that Jerry left off with. And I'm going to invite Reverend Willie to respond first. The question I'll just restate for those who may be just joining us and to refresh our memory. Why are people so invested in this system, particularly considering how many people who are connected to us have been impacted by the system? And how do we swing the pendulum toward divesting?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the reason is that there is a crisis of imagination that exists in the public, but also in our congregations. That we have not actually embraced the fact that just because the way something has always been, just because something has been a way as long as we've known it, does not mean that it has to remain that way. And part of what our politics needs, part of what our spirituality needs, is a different type of imagination that actually does not just use the neural capacity for reflection, but also tries to envision, speak up, and spark a world that we have never seen before. So part of it is a crisis of imagination, that we have not figured out that we actually can live in a society that does not have to thrive on punishment. I think another thing that makes us so complicit is that we talk about the necropolitical, right? These politics of death, but we forget that as people of faith, sometimes we are the custodians of, sometimes we are the perpetuators of a necro theology, right? We are committed to death theologies, not just theologies that talk about death and dying, but theologies that often cause death, theologies that undergird genocide, theologies that tell us that someone has to die, someone has to be punished in order for us to be safe, in order for us to live. We can run the gamut of the ways that Christian theology has this tendency of creating others and allowing us to lean into the gift or the supposed gift of othering other people, right? So our theologies are part of the problem. We have a crisis of imagination. That is also the problem. But then another thing that I think is, and this is really to Reverend Woodall's point is, we don't send the pastor in the prison. But the interesting thing is we send people into prison to preach, when the last time I looked at stats, and I'm in a prison every week, couple of times a week, prisons are actually some of the most religious places in the world, right? I am not sure that prisons need more preaching, right? I think we have to figure out, what does it mean to go to prison where we're helping sisters and brothers build power? And I think this is, as someone who loves your father's ministry, is consider myself a disciple of what your father did and does, Reverend Jerry, is that if we're not thinking about how our engagement with the carceral system, whether that's in local jails, whether that's in the detention centers, whether it's in state, federal prisons, if it's not thinking about how to help people who've been radically disempowered because they've only lived in a caste system along the lines of race and gender, if we're not willing to help them build power, I don't know that our religious pageantry and our ceremonialism are actually having any impact on what goes on in prisons and what happens if brothers and sisters make it home.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, 100% on point. And the direction you were going with our theology and what we believe about the cross, what we believe about salvation, what we believe about what it means for us to be washed in the blood, all of those things.
And made white as snow. Like don't forget
Yeah,
the white as snow.
Listen, you black, you been black, you go be black. We have to shift our theology. We got to shift our theology, and not just our theology about the cross and what it means for Jesus to be innocent, because if we really read the text, he was guilty of a lot of the charges that a lot of the crimes that he was charged with. But we like to see him as innocent because we like to see ourselves as also the arbiters of justice when people are not innocent. So our theology about who Jesus is and what he represents, and our theology about the cross, but also our theology about the afterlife. What does it mean to damn and condemn people to hell? What does it mean to say that you'll go to heaven if you live right, you live just, you make this commitment or that commitment, but you go to hell if you succeed at being human and succeed at having faults and succeed at not knowing and succeed at not having? All of those things matter. And how we talk about favor and how we talk about blessings and how we look at people who do not have that favor and those blessings, all of those things matter. And so the theology of the Black church has to shift drastically before we can start looking at prisons and policing and incarceration as a system that is a problem. And that leads me to the next question, actually, is that a lot of people are invested in this system. How do we start swinging the pendulum the other way? For some of us, it's abolition. For some of us, there's always going to be a need for punishment. There's always going to be a need for isolation. There's always going to be a need for some system of violence for the purpose of maintaining power and control. Is rooted in our theology, is rooted in our social interactions with one another. It's really rooted in so many facets of our lives. And so I want to hear from you all to describe for us your understanding of abolition as an alternative and inclinations toward that political stance, if that's where you stand, and the direct impact that you expect abolition will have on our communities, and in those different areas that we've just talked about, ideologies, socially, politically, economically, all of those things.
So I'll be happy to begin. So I am not an abolitionist. I don't believe in the philosophy of abolition, and the reason why is because I struggle with the presence of harm and trauma, and often in the conversations as I'm educating myself about abolitionist frameworks, and even though not being an abolitionist, working to really not desensitize, to really disintegrate the system that we currently have, because I don't look at it as a dichotomy as to either you have abolition or you have the legal system, right? What I struggle with is if we do not acknowledge the fact that in our current situation, and the way we've disposed ourselves to this legal framework, that the violence is happening on our behalf and it's happening to our people, but it's not is not actually holding responsible the people that is committing the acts of harm. And so I'm afraid that in our theologies, in our philosophies of abolition that allow for us to move beyond the harmful ways of this current legal crises, that we're going to literally allow and forgive, like we always do in the Black tradition, those who are ultimately responsible for their harm. And I am not anywhere in my faith that would allow those oppressors to get off. I serve a God that's not just a God of justice, but is also a God of rage. And in order for us to truly see justice, I believe some harm has to be done. I mean, some harm has to be rectified. And so that's personally why I'm not on the, the bandwagon, if you will, because there needs to be a response. And that is very biblical to acknowledge that those persons who are responsible for the chattel slavery, for the incarceration, for the violence that is being done in our name, in the name of God, and that God is not angry with that, I can't be okay with that either. And so I struggle with abolition. But I'll also say that if I think about the inclination toward that end, what do I do in the right now, in the present moment, that really rectifies the reality that there is being there is folks right now in cages. There are people in communities all throughout this nation and all over the world that are literally being implicated right now as a consequence for these actions. What do we do with them? And so that's kind of where the nexus between the framework of abolition and the actual philosophies and ideologies that inform the work that we do. And granted, there are people who do believe in abolition that I can work with, because at the end of the day, my job is to save, or not save, but to amplify humanity. And so that's kind of where I enter into the conversation.
Other thoughts? And if abolition is not where you find yourself on the political spectrum, you can also share what you see as an alternative, where you see us swinging the pendulum in the other direction.
Yeah, thanks so much. I do identify as an abolitionist, but not simply or exclusively a prison abolitionist. I believe that abolition is the response to systems of oppression. I once heard an AME brother, Brother Charles Boyer, once say that our ancestors didn't call for slavery reform; they called for slavery abolition, because abolition is the response. It should be the response to every system of domination, subjugation, and oppression. The abolitionist movement defines prisons and policing as oppressive systems, right? And in the tradition of W.E.B. Du Bois, who, as he's working through defining and interpreting the period of Black Reconstruction, of the Reconstruction era, he calls for what he terms as abolition democracy. What an abolition democracy means that we destroy, uproot, decimate these systems of domination, but we must build something in their place, right? And so as an abolitionist, I'm not just calling for the end of something, I'm also calling for the reconstruction of something. I'm calling for the building of something in its place that actually is committed to human sustainability and human flourishing, right? So the call for the end of prisons, from my vantage, is not a call for wholesale, unqualified absolution of harm and wrong that people have done, but it is to say that the way we approach harm and the guilty is not humane, and it doesn't represent the fullness of who God is, nor the fullness of who we are. It is to say that yes, we must do something in order to protect the public, in order to secure safety for the public. But it is to say prisons are not that answer, because they have not worked. And that's what I mean by a crisis of imagination. We have to figure out, how do we reimagine, what do we do with people who cause harm? What do we do with those who have been harmed? What do we do in a systemic way that actually represents our humanity, but also honors the humanity of those who didn't live up to their humanity, those who are guilty, right? I don't know if it's another name. I don't know if it's another institution. What I know is that inflicting harm and deadly punishment on human beings for the wrong that they have done does not actually keep this country safe. And so we have to figure out, as I think abolition is a faith tradition within itself. It believes that another way is possible, and we have to figure out, how do we come to that other way? This is the last thing I want to say on this, and that if we have to get people who do harm outside of the public square, and I think we do, people who do harm should not be in the public. But how do we send people away as punishment, but not send people away to be punished, is a part of the question that we have to ask ourselves.
Whew. Drops the mic. Drops the mic. Yeah.
All right. If you have some thoughts, I'll hear them, Jerry. But we
yes, and amen.
I know that's right. I know that's right. I just want to pull from I'm pulling from Miriam Kaba's "We Do This Until We Free Us," because she talks about abolition as organizing and transforming justice, not just as a destruction, right? And so she talks about, in this book, I'm going to quote her, "We are not abandoning our communities to violence. We don't want to just close police departments. We want to make them obsolete. And so we must have a vision of a different society built on cooperation instead of individualism, built on mutual aid instead of self-preservation." And I think you will love this line, Reverend Willie. It says, "We must have a radical reimagining of how we address various harms." Those are very important, critical points to understanding abolition as a framework, not just as a matter of destruction, but a matter of building up, a matter of imagination, a matter of creating a new heaven and a new earth where all of God's children can live the abundant life that Jesus came to give, if that's what we believe. Amen. So this question, I want to hear from all of you. Actually, let me not get ahead of myself. It's 6:15, so we're going to take one more commercial break. And before we do that, there's many people who joined the room after our last commercial break, and so I'm going to recognize them. I see my godmother in the room, Sister Glenda Binion. Good to see you, godmom. Best friend Faith Garnett out of Arlington, Virginia. Sister Sheila Prince is in the room. Brother Clyde Howard, Reverend Nellie Pearl out of Augusta, Georgia, Brother Alan Christopher, Brother Phil G, and Sister Erica Williams, a wonderful sister in the struggle, a faithful fighter for our people, Mary Tibbs Brooks, Sister Patricia Wright, Sister Vascola Stoney. Good to see all of you in the room. Welcome to this conversation. I hope that something that we're sharing is something that you can take back to your communities, and something that you can share with your community, so that we all might have an opportunity to learn and grow and build together. All right, one more commercial break before we come back to our final segment.
Allen University is a small liberal arts institution in Columbia, South Carolina, where we provide small class sizes, dedicated faculty, and a diverse curriculum.
Allen University has provided me with opportunities that will enable me to move confidently toward a fulfilling future.
My time here at Allen University has helped me grow in the field of information technology, and I'm sure it'll help you grow too.
Come to Allen University, where we teach the mind to think, the hands to work, and the heart to love.
Welcome back, family. I want for you all to share, you all who are from all over. Reverend Willie is out of New Jersey. Reverend Jerry is out of California. Reverend James is in Atlanta right now. So all across areas across the United States. And so prisons and policing and incarceration and the movements all look different in those different areas. What you're up against looks different. The context is different. And so I like to hear from you all some of the ways that you're working to make prisons and policing obsolete, or supporting communities who are directly impacted, either in your own work or as part of a collective, but in your context specifically?
Okay, I guess I'll go first. As I move through this doctoral program at the ITC, to further the work, I am, and you know what, I was just reminded that as a disability advocate, I started this all wrong and did not give reverence or honor those who may be visually impaired. And that is a grave injustice to our community who is listening, however, unable to actually see us. And so I am sitting with a beautiful photo of a Black woman who is colored. I have on Black, mainly all Black today, because today is Thursday, and I do stand with the World Council of Churches, Thursdays in Black, towards a world without rape and violence. I have on Black glasses that have speckles of pink, a Black t-shirt, and a Black denim jacket. I am brown, kind of a honey brown complexion, and my hair is a light brown. And so please forgive me for missing that in the very beginning. I am indebted to the call on my life to continue to work with those who are incarcerated, particularly women, because there are systems and then there are people. And I am in direct alignment with human-centered design thinking from an African-centered perspective. My work is through the lens of the butterfly effect, the concept that small causes can have large effects. And we seek to cultivate social consciousness and awareness encompassing the issue of unjust and disproportionate mass incarceration, particularly of women of color, and the hopelessness experienced during incarceration. We are, as I move through this DMIN work, I am really working towards the work of the church, of the Black church, and actually doing the work of soul care with the justice impacted, not just sending preachers or their pastoral team in to preach at those who are incarcerated, but to really work with them so that they have what it takes, especially upon reentry, something that will sustain them and hold on to them. And I saw, I believe it was Sean's question early on, or comment, I'm not sure if that, Sean Jackson, who talked about the jails and what happens in the jails. And so having experienced that, knowing that, as Willie said, some of these, whether it's detention centers, jails, federal prisons, state penitentiaries, can be some of the most spiritually based places. Really going in and honing in on that and working with the individual to instill in them that just because they have been separated, whether guilty or innocent, but just because they have been separated from the whole of community, all that they love, that we continue to minister to the soul of the person, to pour into them and to empower them to discover and develop inner strength to impact change in their lives, which then promotes the healthy families and the communities. And so that is the work that I am doing in order to go in and actually train churches to not just go and preach Jesus, to those who are incarcerated, but to really begin to work with those individuals who come in for those worship services or who long for the weekday Bible study, to really begin to work with them and pour into them, so that it's not just this lofty thought of Jesus saves, but actually those that Jesus sends to help them save themselves from recidivism, to help them save themselves, so that when they come out and are faced with all of these no's and all of this negativity, that they don't instantly think, well, I might as well go ahead and do something else that's going to put me back in prison, where I don't have to worry about a job. I don't have to worry about housing. I don't have to worry about how I'm going to eat because I got 3 hots and a cot. They're going to make me do something in there, whether it's go to class, go to school, or just get up every day if you're in jail or just in a detention center, sitting around doing nothing but watching television. So to be able to go into these places of incarceration, whether they are holding cells, wherever they are, and to really work with the individual and our churches, those who are concerned about the least of these, those who are concerned about doing the work of prison ministry, to really minister to the soul, the person, the human who is now caged behind bars, may never see another family member. And so that is the work that I am most passionate about, the work that I am doing to help to change and reduce the recidivism rate as we continue to move towards an end, to where we then go at the same time and fight the systems that keep us dealing with mass incarceration and the loss of our families, our communities, our leaders, our mothers, our fathers, the physical loss. And so I am just working diligently to really connect with those in the Black church, especially those who think they are doing prison ministry.
Reverend Willie?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, and Reverend Jerry for outlining all the wonderful things that help to get us to a more decarcerated space here in what is the world's capital of incarceration and punishment. At Mount Zion, we have really been committed to these practices of expungement, these opportunities for people to have their records sealed or their records expunged, which we have found creates significant opportunities around employment, around housing. An expungement can determine whether or not you will regain custody of a child. And so we have attempted to be a part of that post-incarceration story. In the last 4 years, we have helped 1,200 sisters and brothers expunge their records, which, as they tell us, have been life-changing, because it is important to know that when one has served their time, that they should not come home to a prison with invisible bars. And so we have been committed as a congregation to undo those invisible bars that bind the opportunities and the options of so many brothers and sisters. The other thing that I would mention, and I'm really so proud of this work, since 2020. As you heard Reverend Jazz name, I am Associate Professor of Liberation Theology at New York Theological Seminary, where I have the added gift of being the director of the Master of Professional Studies program, which is the only master's degree awarded a master's degree program that exists in a New York State prison. It's one of the oldest master's degree awarding programs in the country. And for the last 41 years, we've partnered with more than 530 men at Sing Sing who now have master's degree in a field of theology. And our graduates, they come home to be on the front line of ending mass incarceration. Lawyers, they become lawyers, nonprofit leaders, agency directors. They go on to get PhDs. So many of them are social workers. And part of the gift of that work is I understand that I am journeying with men and now women who are building power in dead zones, in places of death, like prisons, who are reasserting their humanity on a daily basis, who are achieving significant accomplishments. But more than that, they are readying themselves to be on the front line of decarceration. Since I've been at NYTS, not only have we graduated about 20 men, for the first time in the institution's history, we've now graduated 9 women in the class of 2023 when we expanded our program after 41 years to Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. So now in New York State, you have men and women who are now earning graduate degrees, right? Who are seminarians who graduate with a theological education, who have the capacity now, probably well before, definitely well before they came to our programs, but now they are credentialed in a way where they can transform the carceral context that they live in, and then come home and transform the communities where sometimes they were the one that caused the harm, sometimes they were the one who were set up and framed in a lot of ways that led them to prison, to the failed carceral system that allowed innocent people to go to prison. And they come home to these very same communities that are reminders of their incarceration, where they do significant amounts of good. So that is one of the highest honors of my life right now, is that I get to partner with women and men who get to determine, hopefully one day, through their advocacy, through their activism, through their scholarship, through their caregiving as clinical professionals, on whether or not we'll ever need prisons. And that's a high honor that I carry.
I'll wrap us up here. I like to think of the work that I'm engaged in to make prison and policing obsolete, and supporting those communities who are directly impacted. And almost, I use the language of the legal system, right? It's almost as if the 3 phases of a trial, right? Before there's ever an arrest, an indictment, and a trial. The first part of our work is really working to understand the laws and the statutes and the codes that ultimately direct behavior, or holds people accountable for said behavior. And so what it looks like for that is, looking at the laws that are on the books that define what a crime is, right? Because we oftentimes assume that a person who is incarcerated should be there. But when you think about what actually crimes exist, like here in the state of Georgia, we have one of the most broadest statutes and codes in the country. Literally everything a person can do as a human being is criminalized, or could be criminalized if the desire was there. And so looking at different laws, I've worked on, laws like stand your ground, citizens arrest, bail reform, trying to really create avenues where people's lives aren't interrupted simply because somebody somewhere said, I didn't like this activity, I didn't like this behavior. And that's very important, because before we can talk about prisons and policing, we need to talk about how they are using the institution of law to be able to commit harm and do violence. Secondly, when there's an identification that a crime has been committed, if there's agreement that, hey, this is a crime, this is an offense, now what we're looking at is the trial process, the entire process under the law that allows for people to defend themselves. And so what that looks like for us, particularly disparities in policing, disparities in the legal process. whether it's, right to self-defense, whether it's a right to counsel, whether it's, a person's ability to be immune from prosecution, how laws are being implemented in practice every day. RICO is one that's on the news a lot lately. Gangs are on the news a lot lately. What are the implications of these laws in practice, right? Are we actually effective in reducing harm? Or are we just simply locking people away, making ourselves feel better, and creating a violent space, a more violent space, simply because we don't like them, we're angry at them, and so we're going to exclude them from community, but then do more harm to them, and then allow them to come back into our communities, which does reverberate and compound that violence in our communities, in which we have to deal with. And then finally, I'll say is post case, right? Whether it's incarceration, whether it's in once a person returns back from incarceration, the recidivism. We're talking about conditions within these facilities. So people who have been identified as guilty, they go to serve whatever sentence. We're talking about supervised release. We're talking about probation, the injustice that's happening, technology, whether we get rid of prisoners or not, there's a thing to be said about probation, right? How is that doing violence? How is that doing harm? When people are re-entering community after serving their times, they're trying to come back to church. They're trying to go back to synagogue. They're trying to go back to the mosque. The work at MFI, we're touring the country, and we're talking to communities about the narratives of incarceration and how that impacts everyday life, right? There are some people who are struggling to accept people who have been impacted by the legal system, to say, because you served your time, we celebrate you, but you're not welcome in our congregation, in our faith community, because we don't feel safe, right? And part of the work that we're trying to do is really understand what is happening in our theology, what is happening in our cognitive ability to actually deal with these situations. How do we get to this point? The etymology of this system of incarceration. I mean, not the etymology, but how do we get to the knowledge that we're not safe because one person entered into incarceration and now they're back, but they somehow are a safety threat, when in fact some of the most dangerous people have never been to prison, and in fact are sometimes in our pulpit and in our communities and in our churches, right? And so all of that wrapped together, how do we understand each other as human beings? How do we hold each other accountable? How do we ensure that in that process of holding each other accountable, there's equity, there's dignity, there's grace, but there's also accountability, right? And so all of that together for me is the body of work that I'm trying to accomplish, and I'm trying to work with others to do. And it is a very Herculean task, because quite frankly, a lot of us are not ready to have, and I started this way, but a lot of us are not ready to have the conversation about what to do with that trauma, right? There's a compounding effect that we oftentimes see in this work, that if we don't deal with it, it makes the problem worse. And so part of it is trying to figure out, okay, we have this system, we have these traumas, we understand and identify that there is harm being committed. What do we do now? And so the do now part is ultimately what I'm hoping to work to accomplish.
Awesome. Thank you all. I want to be very clear that I did not ask the panelists that question to challenge them or to give them an opportunity to be bragocious, but I asked them that question because I want you all to know that we didn't just invite anybody to come and have this conversation. We invited folk whose feet are on the ground and whose hands are to the plow, but also to let you know that there's space for you in this work. There's space for you on this journey. And so we want you to take the knowledge that you've gotten here and continue studying, continue learning, continue growing, so that you can help to build your communities toward justice and toward a world that is more fit for God's children to live in. So thank you all for joining. Thank you to our panelists for all that you've shared and the work that you're doing. If you are not already, please do follow the Christian Recorder on all of our platforms, and we will see you next time. Peace, family.